Journal continues.
Emilie Kao joins us now. She serves as director of the DeVos Center on Religion and Civil Society at the Heritage Foundation, and much of your work in recent weeks has focused on the Equality Act, which passed the House earlier this month. It was a 236 to 173 vote. Remind viewers what the Equality Act looks to do.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. We believe that all Americans have human dignity and everyone should be treated with respect. Our concerns about the Equality Act are that it elevates sexual orientation and gender identity ideology to become a civil right, to codify that in federal law. It would amend the 1964 Civil Rights Act, add sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity. And our concerns are that there are equality concerns on both sides. This act would turn disagreement on matters like same-sex marriage and gender identity, sex differences, into what would legally be considered to be discrimination. And it would lead to punishment of people who hold a disfavored view of same-sex marriage and sex differences.
How so?
Well, we've seen in the states, there are about 22 states that have passed similar laws, and we've seen a number of cases arise that implicate equality, safety, privacy, and liberty concerns. So one example, there's a homeless shelter in Anchorage, Alaska called the Hope Center, and they serve women who've been battered and abused, trafficked in some cases. And they have a policy of keeping that shelter for women only. And they are now being sued under a similar law in Anchorage that requires them to consider gender identity. So when a man who identifies as a woman came to the shelter and requested admittance after he was in an altercation at a men's shelter, they couldn't allow him in because they wanted to protect the women who were in the shelter. And so they paid for a taxi, sent him to the hospital. He had already been injured in his altercation before. And now they're being sued. And this is an example of how there's more endangerment created by this type of law for women who have a legitimate expectation that if they go to a women's homeless shelter, that they'll be with other women. It's simply traumatizing for them who've already experienced male violence to be in the presence of another biological male. We are not saying that it's people who identify as transgender that create the threat, but creating access to any man who can simply say he identifies as a woman, that is creating endangerment of women and girls.
What's the path ahead for the Equality Act? It passed in the House.
It passed in the House, so I don't think it's going to come up in the Senate. Obviously, there's a huge cultural battle going on, so I think that the cultural battle will continue to go on. I think that what's happening in the states will be a lot of where the action will be. We see a number of laws in the states, not only adding sexual orientation and gender identity to non-discrimination laws, but also bans on talk therapy for people who have same-sex attraction or gender dysphoria. We also see a number of bills about school curriculum where it's mandated to have LGBT curriculum, not only in sex education, but in all subjects. And there are parental groups rising up and saying that we just don't want sexualization of our children at a young age.
We're talking with Emilie Kao of the Heritage Foundation's the DeVos Center on Religion and Civil Society, joining us until the bottom of the hour this morning. If you want to join the conversation, phone lines as usual. Democrats 202-748-8000 is the number. Republicans 202-748-8001. Independents 202-748-8002. You talk about the cultural battle over these issues. Democratic Congressman Mark Pocan was on this program recently. He talked about sort of the public sentiment on civil rights for the LGBTQ community and how that's changed over the years. Here's what he had to say.
I think what's interesting about this issue, before it was a political issue around discrimination for the LGBTQ community, in Wisconsin, my state, we were the first state in the country to have a gay and lesbian civil rights bill. 1982, took 9 years later for another state to do it, and signed by a Republican governor. That's how different it was. At that time, it wasn't seen as a political wedge issue. Unfortunately, it became one over the years. But I think with marriage equality becoming a reality, people see my marriage to my husband has not affected anyone else's marriage. And if it did, they probably had some other issues to deal with. And I think people realize that just treating everyone fairly like they want to be treated is really what America's about.
Emilie Kao, your reaction and the idea of this becoming a political wedge issue in this country?
Well, I think he said something that I agree with, which is that everyone should be treated fairly. And I think that the problem with the Equality Act and what we see with similar laws at the states is that it doesn't treat everyone fairly. It treats people who believe that marriage is between one man and one woman, or people who believe that there are only two sexes. It treats them as, basically the equivalent of racist bigots. And I think there are serious concerns about, for instance, women's sports, about, as I mentioned, single-sex facilities for women and girls, serious concerns among the medical community that the recommended treatments from the transgender community actually harm patients, and particularly for children. The things that are being tried out on children now, experimental hormones, surgeries on minors, double mastectomies on 16-year-old girls. I think there are a lot of medical professionals who believe that their rights should be considered as well. And the Equality Act has, in the states, has led to lawsuits in all of these instances.
Explain the women's sports argument, because that's one we heard quite a bit on the floor of the House amid the debate over the passage of the Equality Act earlier this month.
Sure. So, for instance, there's a young woman, 16 years old, in Connecticut, Selena Soule. She's been a track and field runner for a long time, excelled in the sport. But when she went to the Connecticut championships, she came in 8th in her race because the first and second spot were taken by two males who identified as females. And, she says it was heartbreaking to see that outcome, because everybody knows the outcome of the race before it even begins, and they just believe that, girls should be able to compete against girls. Basically what the Equality Act would do is turn all women's sports into co-ed sports. One of the people who testified at the judiciary hearing on the Equality Act said the Equality Act is going to lead to the end of women and girls only sports. We just saw this weekend in the NCAA championships that the 400-meter hurdles in the women's division was won by a biological male.
A comment from one of those following on Twitter today, it's at CSpanWJ, disagrees with you, saying teaching kids what trans or LGBTQ means is not the sexualization of children.
Well, I think when you're talking about children who are in kindergarten being read a book like I Am Jazz, which is about a sex reassignment essentially, it's incredibly confusing for them. That's why we saw in Rockland County, California, that parents objected to their children being read the story without any parental notification, without any parental consent or opt-out. The fact is that, sex reassignment, it's really not appropriate to talk to kindergartners about it, and teachers are not going to give children that age the full set of information about sex reassignment, which they shouldn't. But the actual person who's the subject of that story, I Am Jazz, went through sex reassignment and experienced incredible pain and complications from it. These are really complicated issues that are far, far too adult and far too sexual for kindergarten children.
It's too